Hello. Welcome to Teaching Artistry with Courtney J. Boddie. That's me. This is a podcast that celebrates artists and advocates for community engagement. And this is We Can't Go Back, a video series in partnership with Creative Generation meant to examine, interrogate, and confront racist policies and systems in the arts. This series amplifies leaders in arts and culture who drive radical change in communities with anti-racist and liberatory practices. Subscribe to the Teaching Artistry with Courtney J. Boddie YouTube channel and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. I live in Brooklyn. That is the lands of the Lenape and the Canarsie nations. And I am currently recording this on the eastern end of Long Island on the lands of the Unkachuk Nation. I identify as a Black cisgendered woman who pays respect and uplifts my ancestors from across the African diaspora in the US and beyond. I also pay respect and uplift the indigenous diaspora that are woven into my history and DNA through a nation of solidarity and love in the Cherokee Creek and Uji nations. Now, let's welcome our guest, Chesney Snow. Hi, Chesney.
Hi, how are you doing, Courtney?
I'm
It's good to see
good.
you.
Good to see you too. Thank you for joining me.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
Excellent. So, Chesney, can you tell us what your role in arts and arts education is?
So, so I navigate a few roles. Actually, I began as a young actor and poet, and beatboxer, finding my way in New York City, and I became a teaching artist really early on. I work for, a variety of organizations in the city, but I also work independently, touring the country as a teaching artist. I have a workshop that I developed called Kindness is My Superpower, which has been really great in elementary schools and middle schools. But I also have a background in production because I founded the American Beatbox Championships and created a film, a documentary feature called American Beatboxer, which was a very popular hip hop documentary that was on Revolt TV and stuff.
So, in terms of just going, how do you embed anti-racism and liberatory practices into the various works that you do?
My work really focuses on like a really deep examination of oppressive institutions and their mechanisms. And then I work to use the power of storytelling and the power of voice, like the expression of voice, to communicate and explore these stories with the truth that an old school journalist would do. So I'm a lover of documentary theater. I'm a lover of the choreo poem. And so I try to use that work to evoke an emotional response. And in the classroom, what I do is I try to dive into these collective traumas, if you will, and find ways that we can actually build ensembles to support each other emotionally. And so I often feel that my role in the classroom is to create the environment, right? And to give these students tools to be able to learn how can they love and support each other and try to flip the ideas that kind of our dominant culture places on them, right? So, for example, when I look at this idea of competition, I try to flip this idea of competition on its head, right? So that we create these battles, and inside of the battles, I'm crafting games that basically say, well, the battle is actually to show how much you can support and love and uplift the other person. So the only way that you can win this battle, right, is to actually show how much love you have. How kind can you be, right? And so, and I got that because, when I'm looking at these systems, I feel like very often the way that our society is structured, it's really obsessed with the idea of competition, the idea of it's the survival of the fittest, and only the strong survive. But in actuality, that goes against the natural processes, right? The way in which species survive is via cooperation, right? Tiger is killing what it needs to eat, right? It's not killing more than it needs to eat. What I try to do inside of my classrooms is to really examine these systems of oppression and also to enter the space where I'm also a student. And I try to make that clear, right? Not meaning that I don't know what I'm going to teach, but I go into the classroom and say, I need to learn from you. And in that symbiotic relationship, I feel like I get the trust and the respect of the student. You know, I was telling you before, I started this program, years ago, probably 10 years ago at the Lavelle School for the Blind. And at this school, I'm going in there and I'm really excited. I'm going to teach these kids beatboxing and wow, I'm doing something really good, is because often we feel euphoria from doing good. Inside that classroom, it took me about 5 minutes to understand that I was the student, right? That I was the one that needed to learn and to be humble, right? Because the Lavelle School for the Blind is a very special place because a student, their way of communicating, whether they like something or not, might be pressing a button. And that's the only way they can communicate with you. And it's a wide spectrum of abilities, right? Because another student can be a musical genius on the piano, right? But the music is so inside of them that if they're taken away from that piano, it physically hurts them. And so they can't help but scream in agony and pain. I learned a lot through that experience, and I think when you're entering that space of stripping away all these things that what society's taught us or what the textbooks have said, and we're really meeting the students where they are so that we can listen. That is one of the superpowers of being in that space and in that moment, with the students to kind of create that equity, I remember, I do a lot of work in correctional facilities, I kind of hate that word, but, they're prisons and jails, and we need to eliminate this idea that we know students because we have to kind of check ourselves at the door. I remember one of the first workshops that I was having there one year, a student said, I said, well, what is it, who are you? What is it that you would like for us to know about you, right? And he said, the one thing I need you to know about me is that I am not a criminal, right? I am a father. I am a brother. I am a son. And in that way, we get to humanize people, right? I think a lot of the times within our educational systems, right, we can get so kind of caught up in almost like a factory. We put kids in the same group based on their age, right? And we really haven't personalized the educational process, right, for students. That's one of the entry points for me of how am I going to confront these racist systems. I think one of the most primary components to it is really we have to confront the ugly truth of racism. We say, hey, racism exists, right? But I think it's really now the dominant culture is really beginning to see that racism is embedded in almost every facet of society and of our lives. And very often, when we're working in these art spaces, we get this sense that, we're all doing good and we're creating, and that's what we want to do. We want to tell stories and create. And so the institutions put blinders on. So very often they don't even see, what they're doing is being racist, right? And then on the flip side to that, am I going on too much?
No. I mean, I feel like there's a question in here that I could posit as you continue around. I think this is where you're going actually about. So how can those of us who work in the arts and culture field be emboldened to forge the future of arts and arts education from a fiercely anti-racist lens when what you're saying now is, we have to get those systems to really confront that racism, one, exists, and two, what it actually has been looked like and how the system has been set up in such a way to perpetuate racism.
Right.
So
Right.
how are artists really, like, what are some ways that we could be emboldened to make those shifts?
There are a few points there that I'd like to dive into. And I think one, we have to create unity within the oppressed, right? See, one of the brilliant things that white supremacist structures did, right, was it divided us as a people, right? And because of this system of scarcity and the competition that I was mentioning before, right? Very often, at least from my experience and experiences that I've seen from other brilliant artists, right, is that sometimes the racism comes from other Black people within those institutions, right, within the entertainment world, within the arts world. And I don't know that those individuals actually end up seeing that it's internalized racism, because very often they are just trying to make that show successful. They're just trying to, they are kind of following a script, right? And so very often I feel like they become isolated or threatened. I don't really know where the internalized racism comes from in those institutional spaces, because I have, my experience guides my actions, right? So when I was starting the American Beatbox Championships, for example, right, the global beatboxing community was really split in terms of you had a women's category and you had a men's category, right? And what I said at that time is I said, well, wait a minute, this is art, right? This is not LeBron James versus, Cheryl Miller. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like, and
I
so,
do know what you mean.
so, I made it a really key point where I was not going to have a separation of the sexes, right, in our competitions. So the women had to compete against the men, and the men had to compete against the women, right? Now for the first, I would say, year, it was a challenge, right? Because this is something new, right? And I think that, I think there was this intimidation, that these brave young women who stepped on that stage to be the best beatboxer in the country felt, because everything in dominant culture was saying this is a male-dominated, a very masculine kind of space, and it had also become a very white space. But after like the first year or two, the women began to rise and rise and rise to the point to where they were becoming on par and beating the best men, right? And so I think, for me, that making that decision was not revolutionary, right? For me, that was truth, right? For me, that was equality. For me, that was equity, right? And I was never threatened by, if I build this platform, it's going to say, hey, these beatboxers, maybe they'll be better than you, and maybe they'll have more work than you. No, I wanted to build the platform so that everybody could rise. I think that if we're going to confront racism, as a people, we have to really truly unify and really understand what is owed for us in terms of respect, and unify so that we're lifting each other up and not tearing each other down, right? Out of this kind of false sense of scarcity that these white supremacist structures basically thrive on. That's what they thrive on, right? Secondly, I think, once that process is, once we're really doing that and we're coming together and we're confronting our past, I think we have to look at the the institutions really do have to look at the economics, right? People are coming from different places, you know? Like, for example, if I grew up in rural Mississippi and we came up out of poverty, right? And I have to climb my way to the top of the theater world, right? That's a very different experience than someone who didn't have to do that. It doesn't necessarily mean the other person is less talented or has less to offer, right? But my journey, or people who have journeys like mine, need to be acknowledged in these spaces, you know? Once we kind of get at the ground level of actually seeing Black people for who we are and what we contribute, right? Then we'll be able to kind of, you know, I think move forward. But very often I feel like we're constantly tearing people down, I feel, you know, in the arts community to look at our faults sometimes, right? So, and this is what I mean by that. I would never be able to say, for example, this might be controversial on a podcast, so I don't know if it'll get some clicks, but I would never say that Black people, for example, are not deserving of equity because the Black community does X, Y, or Z. Some Black people say that in our industry, right? And so what we have to understand is that those are tools and tactics that white supremacists have always used, right? Have always used to say that, well, you know, Black people don't like this, or they treat people like this. So one example would be, you know, there's this mythology that, well, the Black community, right, is anti-LGBT, right? That's this common myth that is perpetuated over that we are more against LGBT than other communities. That was not true. That is not a truism, right? Little Richard, right, was famous way in the Black community, way before he was ever popular in dominant culture, right? So if we need to listen to people who are really in the struggle in terms of like studying and examining this type of work, right? And not necessarily to just celebrity, right?
Yes.
You know, I think that, you know, that's kind of been one of our challenges, you know, is as a culture, we're very kind of, we're rooted in celebrity culture, you know. You know, not to call out names, but we all know, you know, our poor brother who's struggling right now. It's not that he shouldn't have a voice, but when you think about Black politics and like what's really at stake, you really want to be serious about it. Like, we have empathy for this brother. We know who we're talking about, right?
I think so.
Yeah, we talking. You know, yeah, I'm talking about Yeezy, right?
Yeah, okay. There's another one too that I wasn't sure if you were going to. Yeah, I hear you. Okay, keep going.
You know, you feel what I'm saying? So it's like massive empathy for this brother, right?
Yeah.
But we have to be serious about politics and Black politics. You know, Black Lives Matter, the movements, really kind of forcing us to, you know, to say, you know, we need to get serious about what politics are. You know, there are lots of different movements out there that, you know, I think are really bringing the idea of like reparations, you know, really thinking about, you know, police brutality, economic justice, you know. And when you have something like what Kanye did, it makes politics a circus, right? And I think that as the artistic community, we have a responsibility, right? As Paul Robeson spoke of, as Nina Simone spoke of, in these great traditions, like we have a responsibility to tell the truth. And we have a responsibility to do that fearlessly, right? And I think it starts in the classroom.
So, as a final question,
Yes.
What does a liberated and racially just world look like?
You know, I don't think you can have any kind of racial justice in America if you don't deal with the historical past of America, right? You can't just sweep it away and say, well, that was the, well, now we're going to start from here. We're going to be from here. You can't start from here, right? Right? These are scars. These are wounds. You're talking about centuries, right? You're talking about a trauma that's embedded. Yeah, I'll give you an example. When I started to look at my art and say, after Trayvon Martin, and then Mike Brown, and Tamir Rice, and the names just kept coming. And I said, well, what am I doing with my art? When I look back, right, like, how am I going to say, like, I did something with my art that was more than just entertaining people, right? When I was seeing, like, Mike Brown's body lay out in that street and see for hours, I said, who was he? Who were his grandparents? Who were his great-grandparents? Who was his family, right? And as the protest started, I kind of felt removed, because I was like, I don't want to go out in the streets. What is that doing? We've been out in the streets for a long time. This was my thought. Now, it doesn't, not to knock people go out in the streets. I'm for it. What I was looking at that moment was, I said, you know what? If the professional St. Louis athletic team, right? If a professional team struck, right? Then something would be done, right? Because that professional team brings money. Billions of dollars, right? If they're not out there playing, that city is now losing tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars. Then what happens? Then the people who actually run that community, which are the people who have money, then contact the sheriff and say, you're costing us billions of dollars, fix this, right? See, this is the idea of economic power. And if we don't have economic power, we'll never be respected, right? Like I remember the times that I was up at Harvard, and not to just throw Harvard like this, but many institutions, you can find people, doing all sorts of crazy stuff, but the SWAT teams aren't running up in there. Why? Right? So we won't have any type of racial justice or inequity or equity until we confront the ugly truth of the economic disparity, right? Because what's happened is that the way in which we've gone about, like, in the arts too, putting forward these ideas that, like, we see famous black people on TV, and we see famous people a lot, right? But when you look at the data, the numbers, right, do not belie that, right? Most black people's economics are in their values in their homes, not in stocks, right, or securities, right? And so until we can, get that equity on an economic scale, right, and start investing in those communities, we will never have justice. So to me, a just world looks like, a young person is not only able to, like, walk out, a young black person or young black child walks out into the street, the thought in their mind is not, I can die today, right? And so when I remember when I was, back in the Midwest during this COVID, and I'm looking around this little small town, right? And this small town is not rich, right? But it's wealthy, right? Little small, they don't have, there's no Bentleys, right? But it's wealthy because it's safe, right? They're not, the people are not locking their doors, right? It's just a little small town. but it's pretty much homogenous for the most part, right? Right? Because black people not being allowed to move in there, people of color not allowed to move in there. See, that's wealth, right? When you have community after community after community after community that we don't even live in and exist in, right? Right? And so I think that that's what it looks like to me. When you can go to black communities and you see that those communities have resources, right? Right? That you have children in New York City that live in one of the great cities ever in terms of culture and arts. And I would meet kids that had never been to a Broadway show, right? Kids that had never really, truly, been to the museums, right? Or the Apollo, right? But yet they live in one of the greatest cities in the world, which I think New York's a great city, and I think it'll bounce back. But that's what a racially just, equitable world looks like to me.
Thank you so much for sharing things that are very thought-provoking, a little insight into your heart and into your mind.
Thank you.
And thank you all for watching Teaching Artistry with Courtney J. Boddie. This conversation and more will be on the audio podcast, so subscribe to SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. As we say here, we won't go back, can't go back, onwards.
Now is my time to shine. When your time comes, don't postpone it. When others down and out, you don't condone it. Truth be told, yourself is your toughest opponent. When your moment comes, grab hold and own it. Never let go, stand tall and hold tight. Overcoming obstacles is the objective in life. Doubters all the night, and unto them you shine bright. Cause inside your head, on goes the light. Ignite.